Deputy President.
The Leader of the Government.
If only, Mr. Deputy President.
No,
We'll give it a few years. We'll give it a few years.
Just a slip. Just a slip.
I was, Mr. Deputy President, I was also a member of this committee, and I speak now to the committee report. And of course, it is important to acknowledge that in the wake of this report, in fact, before the ink had even dried on the publication of this report, the legislation authorising the part privatisation through the means of 99-year leases of the electricity distributors and the transmission system was brought through the Parliament. And it is a shame that even if this was to be embarked upon, that the recommendations of the committee were not given full effect to. And I'll just talk about them briefly. Recommendation 1 was that the Deloitte Access Economics report should be independently reviewed. This report was comprehensively rubbished and debunked during the committee evidence, and so it's not a case of getting a second guess. It should have just been consigned to the waste bin. Even supporters of electricity privatisation, such as former New South Wales Labor Treasurer Michael Egan, said he had no time for this report. It was of such poor quality, and so the government shouldn't place any weight on that report, but it did. The second recommendation was to review within 12 months the powers of the Electricity Price Commissioner. This, of course, was a great smoke and mirrors trick perpetrated by the government because the Australian Energy Regulator sets out in its determination how much money these companies can charge the wider public. That has an indirect effect, of course, on prices. There was no independent or other mechanism, no charter given to the Electricity Price Commissioner to ensure that the so-called benefits said to come from privatisation would actually flow through. In fact, amendments were put to that legislation that would actually give some kind of benchmark and power to the Price Commissioner to actually ensure that prices in each consecutive year were lower for consumers. But the House, of course, chose not to embrace that. And so what we have with the Electricity Price Commissioner is a white elephant, an expensive white elephant. And of course, reviewing its powers within 12 months will not add one jot to consumer protection. The third recommendation about sufficient apprenticeships was, of course, a good one and supported, I think, by all committee members. It's just a shame that the electricity companies are not embracing that and seem to be dropping the ball on not just. Well, that's right. I acknowledge that. Recommendation number 4 sets out a number of employment protections that, if you are to go down this path, should be embraced in any authorising legislation. And I won't enumerate them, but I think the previous speaker, the chair, did that. What, of course, was notable is that when those amendments were put fairly and squarely to this chamber, persons who signed up to them in the committee process did not follow through in the legislative process. And I think that is disappointing, and I will now come to one particular problem that flows from that. If you look at Schedule 4 to the legislation, which was enacted on the back of this committee, it sets out, based on the AER draft or the current determination, which is unchallenged, but assuming the determination remains as it is, the legislation sets out the appropriate staffing level for each electricity network SOC, being the number of full-time equivalent employees said to be sustainable by the determination, and it sets out for each of the companies to be part privatised how many full-time equivalent employees they should have during the period of the employment guarantee period. For Ausgrid, it's 3,570 full-time equivalent employees. For Endeavour, it's 2,100 full-time equivalent employees, and for Transgrid, it's 1,000 full-time equivalent employees. Now, what is interesting, of course, is in the wake of this legislation, and of course the legislation also provides for no forced redundancies, except as permitted by the Fair Work legislation. At the moment, workers in the industry have the benefit of no forced redundancy provisions in their enterprise agreements. Those agreements expired in December, they're up for renewal, and of course there's hard bargaining, protected bargaining and all the like. But what is notable is that the company's management are seeking to, despite the fact that they have called for voluntary redundancies, and despite the fact that, at least in the case of one of the companies to be privatised, they have enough or nearly enough volunteers for redundancy to do so without force. Nevertheless, the companies are seeking to remove the no forced redundancy provisions and to have forced redundancies to achieve their objectives. But also, and I think this is most unfair, I think it flouts not just the wording of the legislation, inspired, of course, by the committee report that we're now debating, but it flouts the actual words, because company management are actually saying, well, no, those numbers don't refer to direct employees that the company has to employ. They could be filled by contractors who might be employees of different companies, as long as they're employees of somebody. Now, this is a very distorted reading of the legislation. It's certainly not the spirit in which the Reverend Fred and I put forward the amendments to the government legislation. It was not the spirit in which this House resolved this matter. So we have a clear case where the state-owned energy companies' management appear to be pursuing seem to be pursuing an agenda which is not consistent with the legislation, certainly not consistent with the spirit of the legislation. Whether it adheres to the words, no doubt that'll be a matter for IPART to determine. IPART, of course, in the legislation, beginning the very curious role of an industrial tribunal. And so I think this is one of the problems you have when the committee recommendations were not perfectly reflected in the legislation. We have essentially, despite the fact that the level of employment set during the employment guarantee period being significantly lower than the current employment level, and there will be permitted some loss of employment, it seems that the company's management is now seeking to take advantage of that and press it much harder. There is the concern that, of course, under the rubric of the energy regulator's determination, company management is seeking to lower employment in the industry lower than is absolutely required. The energy regulator does not tell the companies how many people they can employ, but they do set the revenues, and it was to be hoped that, of course, management would work with unions and the workforce to preserve as many jobs as possible and to seek other forms of revenues in contested work markets where a number of those companies had previously acquired work to supplement the revenue to preserve jobs. And it's notable that Transgrid, the transmission system, which is also to be 100% privatised under the government proposal, is despite the energy regulator cutting its revenue by something like 25% over the regulatory determination period, it is foreshadowing no job losses. Whereas, of course, the other companies are shedding them in the hundreds or thousands. We can see a somewhat different management approach, even in the same regulatory environment. And, of course, on the back of this, the government, through the energy company management, is now seeking to challenge the regulator's decision to drive the allowable revenue these companies can charge higher in order that they can get a higher price for the privatisation, because, of course, when you're selling a business, any sale price will be a multiplier of the revenue, and of course with the revenue for these companies being cut by anywhere up to 30%, that will have a downward pressure on the price the government might expect to achieve in the marketplace. So the government's doing everything it can at public expense to drive up the prices to get the higher privatisation price. And of course that is most regrettable. A more regrettable feature of this, of course, is the fact that the government in the budget estimates process recently, through two ministers, the Minister for Energy and Resources and of course the Treasurer, have failed to come clean on how much money is being spent on the challenge to the Australian Energy Regulator's determinations. This will be a matter pursued in other forums, Mr Deputy President. But what we have here is clearly a situation where regrettably the report did support the part privatisation, but it did so on a very clear basis, of employment protections and ensuring that a sufficient number of apprenticeships would continue to be offered in the industry. There is no on the back of that, the Parliament didn't enact the employment protection guarantees as recommended, and even on what the Parliament did enact, it's quite clear that the energy company management is now departing from the spirit, if not the wording of the legislation. So the whole basis of the committee's support for the part privatisation has, in my respectful view, been completely debased and removed.